Hi, everyone. It's Sarah and Teresa joining you for this week's newsletter. Hey!
Hello.
And this week we wanted to talk about some of the common reasons and things that contribute to misunderstandings and miscommunications. One of the things we know is that certainly there are times in relationships when things happen because of intentional, malicious self-protection mechanisms, and there are times when things happen unintentionally. And what we want to do is highlight on those times when things can happen a little bit more unintentionally so we can be aware of it. One of the stats that we often reference in our work together is, and this comes from the work of Judith E. Glaser from Conversational Intelligence, and what they found in their research is that 9 out of 10 conversations will miss the mark. So just think about that for a second, and miss the mark could mean we're intentionally pushing each other or poking each other. It could be because we're not listening to each other. Maybe I'm distracted with something that's going on at home. It could be I'm thinking about a rebuttal to your defense and all the reasons why you're wrong. It could be that we aren't, we're making assumptions about what each other means. And one of the things when we think about organizations is organizations are centers of human relations. So there's kind of 3 areas we're going to focus on today in our conversation with you. Assumptions, right? Those nasty little things that feel so true and so right in our brain. A lack of empathy and a lack of being willing to listen to learn. And then just some of the challenges that come with using digital technology, as so many of us do in these days. So, Teresa,
Hmm.
kick us
I
off with assumptions and whatever
I
else comes up for you.
I have so much interest in assumptions. We hear the word assumptions, and I think it takes us to a kind of place. But the root of assumptions is that our brains are pattern detecting machines,
Mm,
right? This is how we survive. So it is only natural that it has patterns about things that happen so quickly we don't pick up on them. And this is where assumptions kind of we give rise to these big assumptions. Um, I think the most common places we see assumptions with teams, assuming everyone in a department has a certain view, or
mm,
everyone in a certain age group
mm.
maybe has a certain view. Um,
Those damn millennials.
those, oh yeah, bless it. I mean, they're middle aged now, but like
Yeah.
still somehow they're getting this bad rep. We love you, whatever age you are listening. Um, or that every team member will react a certain way to news that's going to be shared. Um, and it really is the responsibility of the speaker to check the assumptions they're making and delivering their message, right? I think you can do that a few different ways. I think you can ask questions, like acknowledge in your own mind, I think I'm making a lot of assumptions. I need to get curious because curiosity is a natural antidote to assumptions or those kind of very binary thinking patterns that we have. And I think you can also acknowledge, like, an assumption I'm making is blah, blah, blah. And Sarah, I know you've said before, how true is that?
Mm,
Or I might
mhm,
say, an assumption I'm making is blah. How does it feel to you when you hear that? Or is that close to the mark or is that missing the mark?
mhm.
I think sometimes people are hesitant to name an assumption because they fear that's going to be the part that damages. But I think the damage comes when we just treat the assumption like truth and keep our foot on the gas. Sarah, what comes up for you when you think
Yeah.
about assumptions?
No, I think that's a good point that, for many of us, one, we either aren't even paying attention to the
Mm,
assumptions and naming them as such, but, maybe a fear of not looking smart, not knowing what we're talking about. But just imagine you're in a conversation with someone and they stop and go, I want to test an assumption. I feel like you are saying X, Y, and Z, or the assumption I'm making is this is how you are feeling about it.
mm,
I've been on the receiving end of that. And it always feels it feels really good because I know they're trying to get to what's actually the truth, but it's also a reminder. One of the tools that I would add is that sometimes what happens is, I mean, we could list off 100 types of assumptions we make, right?
yep.
We make assumptions about what we think people know or don't know. But one of the real simple places is that we assume because we're using similar language that we
Mm,
do similar things. And so one of the practices that we can work to get better at to make sure we decrease these misunderstandings and miscommunications, it's the practice of double clicking, right? So think of, like this is a little bit of a dated reference, but on a computer, you double click a file and then you double click it and you go deeper and deeper. And so a lot of times what we'll see is, maybe a team's talking, you're like, I really value transparency. Like, I value it too. Great, we're on the same page. And even though we're using the same language, what transparency means to me is going to look very different than what transparency means to Teresa. So a practice we can use in addition to the, hey, I want to test this assumption is, when you say X, what did you mean? Like when you say transparency, what does that mean to you? What does that look like for you in this situation? So that was just something that I would add to that. So be very aware of those assumptions, try to name them, try to test them, and then make sure you're really clarifying, like, what did the other person mean? We're just so good. Yeah, the story I'm telling myself right now, or I'm noticing this and I'm curious about that. Like I use the language, how true is that? Another way, and unfortunately pretty consistent, more consistent than I think people would be comfortable admitting, is that oftentimes there can be a real lack of empathy and actually listening to learn in conversations, right? That might be because of assumptions we're making, that might be because of biases we're having, that could be because of a whole host of things. And how this can show up, or how we see this sometimes, is when we're working with a team and maybe we're presenting data of like, hey, some people have felt they don't feel included. They feel not only excluded, but they feel discriminated against. And because someone else has not had that experience, they will dismiss that that's a possibility, right? They're lacking empathy in considering that someone else's experience might be different than yours. And the reason I say people might feel a little like, oh, I'm an empathetic person, is because everyone wants to think of themselves as a good person. And the reality is, folks, we're humans, and sometimes we do good things, and sometimes we do bad things, and sometimes it's intentional, and sometimes it's not. But if we want to work on minimizing those miscommunications, one of the things we can really ramp up is that self-awareness and that emotional awareness of the other person, that people have different experiences, also honoring that they have different needs. Sometimes I think we can, if somebody says, well, that's not for me, we can get defensive and like, well, yeah, but what about this? What about this? And X, Y, and Z, instead of like, no, it's okay that you're not into sports and I am into sports. I don't have to defend my team to you, or whatever the situation might be. What would you add to the idea of empathy? And obviously these are all topics, folks, we could spend a ton of time on.
Oh yeah.
We're trying to stay snappy.
It's a hot take.
We're trying to keep these to like you being able to like drink your coffee and listen as we chat.
Something that I've been working on related to listening with empathy and making sure I'm just listening is really trying to cue into my tells. So I can tell I'm not really listening. I'm thinking about a situation at home when I'm only listening for my to-do item, which is probably fine if I'm in like a tactical or kind of stand-up meeting, right? But one of my kids was telling me something and I felt like my brain was just like chucking the things off to the side, like, because I knew when I hit the pause button and was like, why am I doing this? Like, this isn't how I like to show up. I'm not showing up in a way that's meeting the moment, meeting the need. And I think at that moment, I was just tired. I was kind of worn thin. I didn't have a lot to give. And so I was just like, just tell me what I need to do so I can move forward. And by move forward, I just mean go to bed. But so get to know your own tells. How do you know when you're not listening? We're listening in the way that's what's needed in that moment.
Yeah, that's a really great practice. And what I'm thinking about is one of my tells, and I'm not always good at catching it, is especially if it's like a heated conversation with somebody, and my brain just goes to here, I'm preparing my argument. Like either I'm preparing my argument or I'm preparing my exit. Right? Like I'm either like I'm in a fight mode or I'm in a flight mode. And obviously there might be situations where you go, it's not worth it, or I do need to fight, or whatever the case is. But Yeah, but paying attention to those tells, I think, is really powerful. An additional tool I would add, that we often talk about is that we all walk around really listening from a place of what makes sense to us. And how do we challenge ourselves to listen from a place of what makes sense to the other person? And again, to hold that multiple truths can exist, right?
Yeah.
Somebody can experience something different. Related to that, when we think about in any kind of relationship, but particularly in the workplace, and that's why we're so passionate about the work we do, is just it is not the norm in many organizations and teams to have just like a regular structure for feedback and open dialogue.
Yeah.
And when your default is avoidance, what we have found, when your default culture is avoidance, having those conversations can feel like a threat. But part of being able to close the gap, if you will, is our ability to be able to ask for feedback, receive feedback, to be able to sit with our emotions when people share something that's really hard, right? This is where the emotional intelligence comes in, of that self-awareness, but also that emotional regulation, and having that courage to say, this is really tough for me to hear, actually, right? How do I sit with that a bit? And yeah, I think that's just an incredible opportunity for many organizations, I would say, that we've worked with and observed. And it's a practice for us too, right? Like it's not, something that necessarily comes easy to us. And so how do we keep pushing ourselves to talk about friction points and disagreements? I think like we're a little bit over our time, but I think we can quickly just talk about technology and how that can contribute to miscommunications, because so many of us are using technology, whether it's our phones, whether it's working remotely. And so curious to hear your thoughts on that, Teresa.
One of the things that really sticks out to me is this people default to just one method of communication, right? And so we're assuming a few things there, that what is my preferred is your preferred, which usually isn't the case, or that what I have to communicate will land in this one method. And so, a real example from just this week is I had feedback from a project to share with the person. The person is brilliant and could read and take all this in, but to make sure the message landed or to reduce the likelihood of misunderstanding, I recorded a quick video to go with it, so that he could hear my tone, he could hear me walk through some of these points. It took not much time for me at all, probably saved me a headache of doing some repair on the flip side. um, but multiple ways of communicating.
That's such a great point. And we all know tone gets lost when it's just text. Something can feel sharp when it wasn't intended to feel sharp. Something can feel sarcastic or contemptuous when it wasn't intended to, or something wasn't taken as seriously when you were trying to make a really serious point. And I know for me, my kind of, guideline when I was working in the office, it's different now because we have, as a team, we just talk so much in person or in video calls, is that if the emails have gone back and forth like twice, or the Slack messages or the team messages has gone back and forth twice, at some point I need to give them a call or go over to their desk. And that is something that, we still see, like, well, I want you to read these emails because people want receipts, and I was like, first of all, if you're coming into this relationship wanting receipts, you're not really like setting it up for some success and collaboration. You're covering your CYAing. And sometimes that might need to be the case, but
Sure.
tone gets missed. And so whether that is a phone call or a video call, or, like Teresa was sharing in her example, a video just recording. And sometimes, we do that. We'll just send voice notes to each other of like, hey, just want to be clear. Here's what I was thinking about. This is what I'm curious about. So if you find the frustration is happening in a communication and it's just written, stop. And you don't necessarily, I read a study that talked about how actually just picking up the phone can be more effective at navigating and diffusing conflict than even a video call. And I think what they hypothesize is that, one, there's enough of a space for you to sort of process your emotions without being on view, but you can still hear each other's tone and you can be reminded of each other's humanity. And isn't that what communication is all about?
I sure hope so.
So we want to hear from you. Drop us a note in response to this on what have you found to help you mitigate or recover or repair when there's been a miscommunication, misunderstanding. What are some of your favorite tools? And then we'll be happy to share them with everyone else. So Teresa, as always, thanks for joining me on these.
My pleasure.
And thanks everyone for checking in, and we'll talk with you soon.